And welcome back to another episode of Into the Wilderness, brought to you by CEWIL Canada. I'm your host, Dan Lonergan, and we are once again live from CEWIL 2023 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, having an absolute amazing time. It's my first time out east. I've never been past Quebec before, so just been trying to take in the landscape and the climate, which is changing, ever changing. Very Scotland-esque and misty and damp, but I don't know. I like something about it. Um, so we're into day two of our conference here. First time we've had an in-person conference in 5 years, and it's just amazing to see people building connections. The sessions are absolutely packed, and just really excited to be able to kind of offer this as an additive session throughout the conference and talk to folks who are, some are delivering sessions, some aren't, but it's again always trying to keep with the theme of just talking about work integrated learning and everything in between. So I'm very happy to welcome my next guest, who is a co-op coordinator at Brandon University, also currently doing her PhD at Brock University. Shout out, Brock University, in educational studies, and the dissertation around co-op supervisors. And what do we know about co-op supervisors? What don't we know? So Cora Dupuis, welcome into the wilderness.
Thank you, Dan. Happy to be here.
Glad to have you here, and you're fresh off delivering your session. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But so PhD at Brock. So thanks for choosing educational studies at Brock. And for those of you that don't know, I currently work at Brock once again. And so co-op supervisors. So that's what you're studying, the wide world of co-op supervisors, what we know about them, what it means to be a co-op supervisor. With your research and what you're doing, what is your goal behind it? What do you hope to accomplish with the dissertation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And there's like a number of different components. First and foremost, we know that students are really excited about cooperative education or work integrated learning, and so is post-secondary institutions. But without the co-op supervisor, it doesn't matter how excited those other two groups are. The co-op supervisors are the linchpin, and for those of you who can't see me, I'm threading my fingers together like a linchpin, or a door jamb, or a hinge, to represent that, like, we really do that, the co-op supervisor. And so, to clarify, co-op supervisors are these people in the workplaces who welcome our students to their organizations. So they are supervising the students' time, energy, and resources over the next 4 months, 8 months, however long the work term experience is. So worksite supervisors, co-op supervisors are those key people. And so when I think about the growth of our programs and how we want to do more of it, if we can better understand that co-op supervisor experience, we can then attract more co-op supervisors. Or maybe we identify that there's a gap within the demographics or characteristics of our co-op supervisors. So then we could do different recruitment to attract a different group of people that aren't currently represented. But at this point in Canadian research, we don't know a whole lot about what's happening, or who decides to be co-op supervisors, how long are they co-op supervisors, why do they do what they do. And so there's some research in other places like Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, but ultimately there isn't a whole lot in the Canadian context. And so again, as a PhD student, if you can identify an area that hasn't been explored, then it's like some really rich ground for
Absolutely.
you to make your mark. And I'd say the third part of this is I want to contribute back to organizations like CEWIL. So I get so much from this. And so if I can help others move their co-op programs forward, then
Right.
I want to do something that's meaningful and is going to matter to those that do this work.
Well, I think that's important, right? In terms of what drives you and the research behind it, but also what you hope kind of people go into that level of education and research with, of a real kind of driving purpose behind it. It's interesting that you mentioned, not a lot of research in this area in Canada, given how prominent cooperative education is in Canada. Even CEWIL, previously CAFKI, being focused solely on co-op, and even just how many of our members come from that space. And I mean, I think if you ask anyone who works in a co-op department about navigating co-op supervisors, it's 100% something that they've dealt with at some point or
Mhm.
on an ongoing basis, right? If obviously, you've got different levels of engagement from supervisors, probably where they are in their life cycle as a co-op supervisor.
Mhm.
Whether they've never taken a student before, or they're
Mm.
part of a large, kind of corporate firm that's their bread and butter. They just take,
Mhm.
50, 75, 100 students from co-op from across the country.
Mhm.
Um, Very differing levels of understanding, I'm assuming, how they
Mhm.
how they approach being a co-op supervisor. So, okay, so Canada doesn't have a ton of research, so
Yeah.
that's what you're looking to contribute to. What the research that is out there from other countries, what does it say about, the co-op supervisor?
Mhm. So, um, well, uh, it definitely, when it comes to understanding what do co-op supervisors do, other researchers have identified certain what I'll call keywords or titles that
Okay.
a co-op supervisor might have. So that could be administrator, manager, educator, assessor, supporter, teacher, trainer, facilitator, guardian, gatekeeper, storyteller, role model, coach, and mentor. So again, looking at a kind of a dozen or so different sources, and these are the terms that they use to describe. And so what's interesting is that sometimes a co-op supervisor embodies each role on its own, but sometimes those roles collide. And so it can be especially difficult when those roles are like assessor and mentor. So I'm evaluating your performance, but I'm cheering you on to be successful. But for whatever reason, you're not
Mm,
grasping the concepts, or you're just not,
not working out.
yeah, it's not
Yeah.
working out. And so I have to assess your performance, but I really want you to succeed. And that's a conflict there. Another two dichotomies is the idea of being the student's guardian within a workplace, but also the gatekeeper to the profession. So if a student just isn't ready to do something on their own yet, then the role of that supervisor is a powerful one for sure.
And I'm assuming too, that depending on that supervisor and the level of students that they're taking on. So whether it's a first work term student, or if they're in a kind of a accredited co-op program, a third work term student, that maybe that is what, if a supervisor embodies one or more of those types, does it almost perpetuate the student that they prefer to take, right? And you hear that
Mm,
coming, where it's like, oh, I only want
mm,
third, or soon to graduate students, or in some, I only want a graduate level
mhm,
student. And we even see that in other types of work integrated learning, where there's this perception of skill development, or skills that the students have, or their competencies or capabilities. So they come with almost, I'll call it a bias
mhm,
towards the level of student that they want, and almost suspending really what they need to hire, or to engage with, but just kind of pushing that forward.
mhm,
Yeah, that's just kind of an interesting approach of, well, what do they already come either with in the back of their minds, or in other cases in a positive way, like what do these co-op supervisors come equipped with,
mhm.
and maybe that increases the longer they've been a co-op supervisor.
Well, that brings up a really interesting point that so yes, co-op supervisors is an umbrella idea,
Sure.
but then within that group, who are these co-op alumni supervisors?
Mm,
So these are former co-op students who have now graduated and gone off into the world, and they're pursuing their careers, and now they're at a point where they could welcome a student to their organization,
right.
and they're like, wow, someone made space for me once upon a time, so I'm going to make space for a student. And so I myself, I identify in that category. I was once a co-op student, and then I became a co-op supervisor, and now I'm leading a co-op program. And so finding ways to create more co-ops, including in my own office. So yes, there's been one study done out of Australia
Okay.
in 2019. So actually,
Mm,
it's fairly recent. So they set out to investigate, is there a legacy impact to former involvement with co-op or WIL? They use the term WIL
yep.
more universally than we do. But so they had a sample of 21 graduates at 3 Australian universities, and it was semi-structured interviews. And so through the interviews, they did data coding, and the idea of a virtuous circle emerged. So as supervisors, these former co-op students could give back to their industry or to their university, and they could pay it forward to the next generation while also developing their leadership and mentorship skills in the process. So it was this win-win-win idea. And so from that study, which is what's great as a PhD student, if you can point to like someone who said, there is something distinct about co-op alumni becoming co-op supervisors. So there's a phenomena there that's worthy of exploration. And so the authors emphasize that future research should compare and contrast those who come with co-op experience as former co-op students,
Right.
and those that don't. And so how do they approach that supervisory role differently?
One, and I can imagine there's probably a multitude of factors as to what would prompt someone to want to do that. Obviously, the most positives, they had a really good experience. They had a really good co-op supervisor. They embody what that means, wanting to kind of give back to the next generation and engage in that way. Or I can also imagine probably the flip side of that might happen.
And so the session today, so I came to CEWIL to share, this is what I've learned so far.
Right.
But I really wanted to know from our community, let's have a conversation about co-op supervisors and what does our community want to know? What does the CEWIL community want to know? And so that was actually one of the ideas that came up, is how many co-op supervisors had a negative experience and are therefore committing themselves and the opportunities that they have available to then create a much better experience for someone else.
Right. That desire to be better than the experience that they had, which, unfortunately for them, if that was the case, but still having enough drive and motive to say, like, you know what, I want to change this at the company that I'm at now, or whether, and I've seen it too, where students who have come from co-op programs now work at a company who has never historically engaged with co-op students, and they've been able to articulate their position strong enough to, convince whatever senior administration, management to start hiring co-op students.
Sure.
And the impact that can have on an organization who's never engaged with students that way before can be, pretty significant.
Yeah. So that to me would beg the question, are we engaging with our students while they're still students? Are we engaging with our alumni?
Right.
In a way to empower them to have those conversations with their companies in a meaningful way, or what would it take, or what do they need? And so again, bringing it back to the great conversation we just had in our session, they want to know, like, what supports do co-op supervisors want? And so how much is too much, or what is not enough, or what is their educational background, or maybe they're really well supported within their organization on supervisor skills.
Right.
So they're good to go. But maybe it's an owner operator. Maybe this is their first ever hire. And so there may be people who need more. And so again, thinking about, asking co-op super, what do you need, or what are you expecting out of this? Speaking of what to expecting, so another idea that came up.
This happens. The lights go off in this room. It's like a sensor. There we go. It happened on the last one. That's a recurring.
I just had a bright idea.
Yeah.
The lights came back on. So another was like, what skills are co-op supervisors looking for from our students?
Okay.
So that's kind of like a whole new area of inquiry that we could pursue, asking co-op supervisors. I also think what barriers exist, or what do they need in order to hire more? So you may have some employers that hire once a year, and maybe it's industry specific. So they only need people during a certain time of year, but maybe they didn't realize that they could hire at the other times a year, or maybe they didn't think within their organization there could be other growth opportunities. So again, like, what's holding you back, or what would open the door to more co-ops working at your organization?
Right. And yeah, like you mentioned, there's probably a number of factors that play into that. But so you mentioned, okay, how do we leverage the student, or is it leverage the student, or is it, the alumni, or at what point in time does that happen? I don't know if you've started looking into that, or even from the session today, but it's been a topic that even just from alumni engagement, period. What is that sweet spot? And again, if we're talking about engaging them in courses, so whether it's like guest speaking, or kind of in my world of experiential education, when do you engage them to potentially be a project partner, depending, or how do you build that in them if they've done it as a student, to know, hey, I can come back one day and engage this way. And it's not always just about donations and dollars in that sense. So as far as becoming a co-op supervisor, obviously, if they're in a position that warrants hiring co-op students, is there a sweet spot that you've identified yet, or is it something you're looking at?
I mean, if I had to guess, and that's where I am in my research, I'm just at a kind of exploratory stage. But eventually, like, we will identify participants, and there's likely be. I want to do a mixed method study, so there'll be a quantitative component and a qualitative component. But if I had to guess, I would assume that most people are doing this early career. So they see co-op students as an opportunity to work on their own leadership and mentorship skills. And that could open the door to potentially a promotion in the future.
Right.
So you may be too early career to lead a team, but you could lead a co-op student and gain some experience there.
Yeah.
And the other benefit is that, especially if you're part of an organization that hires all 3 semesters, then you iterate your management style every 4 months, because then you start kind of with a new student and you're like, well, this didn't work, but this did, and I'm going to try it again, and so on. So co-op students can be a really great way for early career people to better their leadership management skills. But again, this is all speculation.
Right.
I don't know for sure. And I'm drawing on my own experience. I was early career when I first became a co-op supervisor.
Yeah.
But because you'd have to wonder that if as soon as someone gets promoted to lead a team, then they probably don't have the capacity to hire a co-op student or manage a co-op student on a daily basis.
Yeah. So then who on that team, oversees the student, which then continues, though, to perpetuate that, is that individual equipped to be a co-op supervisor, and or what has the organization prepared
done to prepare them
for, and then on the flip side, what does the institution provide, if in terms of prep or training for first-time co-op employers or partners. And I'm sure that varies from institution to institution, but to your point, what is it that they actually want? And so have they been asked that question? And maybe it's time to ask that question.
Well, and I'd also go out to say that, maybe institutions are asking those questions in a program evaluation type format. And that this would all be like internal data that they're not necessarily sharing broadly. They're not publishing about it. So there may be things that, especially larger, more established co-op institutions, there may be things that they know about their co-op employers. But based on what I can see available, we're not having national conversations about it. So it may be happening institution to institution, but is there something that we could be doing more broadly?
Well, and I think that's, again, coming back to kind of, is there an area that CEWIL can help advocate for some of these pieces and strengthening the content that we have for the industry side of this equation? And that, I think, applies to all types of work integrated learning, because they're, part of what I call the trifecta of players in this space. So what content do we have? What materials can we create? And I think part of, even this podcast, in terms of when I've had industry, is how can we allow them to educate each other for those that do engage in multiple types, but then also where can institutions help inform industry, and then vice versa, and industry inform institutions, and not just from like a program level of, you should have these types of programs at your school, but really like this, like day-to-day operational pieces, especially for, like first time co-op supervisors. Again, if they weren't a student, let's say they weren't a co-op student, they've never taken one before, but they, for whatever, maybe they've heard, maybe there's a funding opportunity, maybe they just think it's the right time, or it's a good idea, or it's an additional way to get, new ideas into the company, get some extra work completed that they've just never been able to get to. So good intentions,
certainly
wanting, but are they equipped to, do they end, like, as far as like writing a job description, like interview practices, EDI issues that come along with recruiting and engaging with students. And then the other piece where I've always seen is like, who is it that's engaging with the student? And this comes into play, whether it's networking events or career fairs, when it's the mom and pop or the small business, it's usually whoever's going to end up supervising the student. And even maybe in some small medium businesses, it's the direct supervisors that attend those. But for some of the large ones, that just takes so many students. Obviously, it's not realistic. So it's probably the HR department, it's the recruiting department, talent acquisition, and some, very sophisticated have a team just for campus recruiting, but that's not the supervisor. So is there a disconnect? And I'm again, I'm going to assume that in some cases there is, maybe not always, but the picture that's painted at the recruiting event versus day one orientation on the job with the person that they're actually going to be, engaging with for the duration of their work term. So I don't know if any of that's come out already, if there's things that you're hoping to get into in all of those areas, but
yeah, certainly I want to pull back the curtain on like what's happening with co-op supervisors, and can we better understand this group so that we can better serve this group, so we can attract more people to join, so that we can maybe even diversify who is a co-op supervisor, because that's another thing we don't know. How many identify as Indigenous or as people of color, or maybe they're a former international student who've now, received or achieved their PR, or they become a Canadian citizen. And so there's there's threads there that I'd really love to pull on, but we don't even know.
Right.
So let's
it's the tip of the iceberg.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you got to start somewhere.
We got to start somewhere.
And then if it
Absolutely.
inspires, the next PhD student, or, a kind of a generational type thing, if it's something becomes a really hot area of research. Again, to me, it makes sense just given how prominent co-op education is in this country. Obviously, the attention it's getting, right, not just right now, it's always received a lot of attention, but work integrated learning in general, and at all levels of government, and the funding available, to making sure that the experience at the end of the day for the student is still one of quality, one that if we can make it as impactful and meaningful as we can as practitioners in this space. And I think part of that is making sure that the supervisor is where they need to be, or that we're at least addressing their needs. And I've said that before in terms of, I think, work integrated learning, if you approach it from a needs assessment, when you're having those conversations, building those relationships, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a successful experience for everybody involved. It's just having those conversations, asking those questions, and not just assuming that people, have it all under wraps, and that they know what they're doing. So,
Yeah.
but it's very exciting. I wish you the best in terms of where in your PhD process, where are you?
Yeah, so I've completed all of my coursework, which is kind of that first phase. I'm in the middle, which is called the comprehensive portfolio. So this is the time where I'm collecting evidence or artifacts to demonstrate that I'm ready to take on my dissertation. So today's conference presentation, this podcast conversation, all of that to me counts as part of my portfolio to, again, go to my committee and say, hey, I'm active in this space. I'm learning about it. Here's where I align myself. Here's where I see myself going, and so on. So then I provided they agree, then I can move on to my dissertation, which is when that like bigger mixed methods study will hopefully take place.
So at CEWIL 2025, we can expect a follow-up presentation.
I'd love to come back next year if the committee will have me. And that was kind of the topic at the end of the conversation of like, how do we find out more? Like, how do we track your progress, Cora? And that's a really valid question that I hadn't really thought about. So maybe I'll get a website and start a blog. And but it is something that many co-op people are grappling with around the supervisor in lots of different ways. So I'm figuring out kind of how do I disseminate this, but certainly there was a kind of a request, can you come back next year and this is where it started and this is where it's going. And so I'd love to be able to do that.
Very cool. Well, and I think it's, it's a starting point of, okay, first it's the co-op supervisor, and then how do we extrapolate that to other types of WIL and what it means to engage with students that way, and things like, service learning or industry projects or clinical supervisors, right? There's subtle differences to each one of those, but you got to start somewhere. And I think,
well, in the same vein, actually, someone in the session was like, "Have you considered clinical supervisors? Because that's a really strong alumni connection. Like,
huge.
You wouldn't be a nurse
Right.
Or you wouldn't be a preceptor if you weren't first a nurse and you weren't first a student
Yeah.
nurse. I would put teaching in that category too. So you're a student teacher, and then you become a teacher, and then after I think 3 years, you can apply to become an associate teacher. And so they're like in the same way that I'm trying to do this cool stuff in the co-op space, there may be some types of will
100%.
that are already advanced. And so bringing that into my research to say, this is what's happening in education, this is what's happening in health or nursing. And there's some really great examples of maybe frameworks that have already been developed or characteristics already identified. I don't know.
See what similarities or differences depending on, again, labels that we put on individuals who engage with students, essentially what happens in these cases.
Yeah.
What does it look like depending on?
But other fields may have already kind of figured this out in what makes sense in their context.
Right. True. Well, I'll tentatively schedule you for a follow-up appearance on the show.
I'd love that.
To next year, the year after that, and see where you're at. But I just wanted to thank you for taking the time and catching you right out of your session and give you a little bit of time to decompress, and it's almost dinner time here, so we'll get some food that way. But thank you for coming on the show, sharing your research, kind of your passion area, and everything in between.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. This was great.
And for everybody listening, again, hey, video, we've got that. The lights keep going out, so thanks for tuning in. However it is that you're enjoying this content, more to come from CEWIL 2023 in Halifax. Until next time, we will see you later.